Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the 7th Sunday of Easter, which is also the final Sunday of Easter, which this year falls on May 29th. We have one quite significant content notification for this episode. During the deep dive into human trafficking, we talk about human and sex trafficking, slavery and incarceration, abuse of vulnerable adults, forced birth, and colonizing adoption, as well as the military and prison industrial complex.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive for this episode, we are diving deep into human trafficking. The Acts reading in particular has to do with a person who is enslaved. And so we wanted to take this time to get into some of the kind of more basic what is human trafficking in the world today. So the kind of baseline of human trafficking is it has to do with moving people from one place to another, and it usually involves economic exploitation and frequently involves enslaving people. So a lot of us are more familiar with smuggling into the U.S., particularly across the southern border of the U.S. Some of that would be considered human trafficking, and some of that would not. There is natural immigration that happens, and there are people who help facilitate natural immigration. Human trafficking has to do with what happens, also has to do with what happens once you get to the place. So if somebody's just helping you cross a border, it's not necessarily what we would call human trafficking, but if they're helping you cross the border and then say that you owe them this enormous debt, and then you have to work in their factory or in some capacity to work off that debt, that's kind of more along the lines of what we're talking about for human trafficking on an international level when it comes to adults.
So historically, human trafficking has been known by a number of names. Of course, slave labor has been well known unfortunately, in several societies. Most of us in America have at one point or another learned about sweatshops, and those still do exist in this country and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
You may have learned about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which happened in New York about 100 years ago and is well known because of the labor law reforms that came after it.
Mm-hmm. And we've mentioned it briefly. I mentioned it one time.
Yes, we've mentioned it before in this podcast.
Yeah.
And you may have also heard a few years ago stories of factories in Bangladesh and in other countries, Indonesia, I believe also, had similar fires, and sometimes those were followed by similar reforms, but it's often difficult to get those enacted.
Mm-hmm. And most of those are multinational US-based, maybe not officially US-based, but US-based companies.
And most of what's being manufactured is sent to the US in the end.
Yep. And so when it comes to having trouble making regulatory changes, yes, part of it is those countries, but a lot of it is the money. I'm following the money, and the money that's coming in to resist those changes is coming from the United States.
Yeah.
And we can link to, I think I have an article that I can find that has some of the top companies that still engage in slave labor and sweatshops.
Yes. Also in America, domestic labor and au pairs and similar types of labor are often not covered by our usual types of labor laws, as well as certain kinds of agricultural labor. And this is especially linked to human trafficking when the person's immigration status is tied to their job, or the documents can be taken away from them.
Yep. And that's something that is not talked about quite as much. But when I was in college, there was at the time, the largest immigration raid in the country happened in Postville, Iowa. Yes. And a big part of that was there was economic exploitation happening and other exploitation happening, but people didn't have the resources. And there are ways where if you're here without proper documentation, but you're a victim of economic exploitation or other domestic violence, there are laws that are supposed to protect you, but basically you have to have a lawyer to know that.
Yes.
So there's a way that it just pigeonholes people who are doing some of the most essential work in the world into not being able to get rights or to advocate for themselves without immense awful repercussions.
Right. Also, in the United States, prison labor is fairly extensive. The
Mm-hmm.
prisoners don't always have any choice in taking those jobs. They are paid significantly below minimum
Like
wage.
cents on, like they're paid cents per hour, not
Right.
even dollars per hour.
And the safety standards are definitely not always what one would hope for.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the ones that is very much legal. Like
Yes, all of that is legal.
in amending the Constitution to outlaw slavery, there's actually, like, it actually includes unless people are incarcerated or like
Right.
somehow in the prison industrial complex. And there's a way in which, particularly connected to human trafficking, right? Like, if you are incarcerated in one place, you should ideally be incarcerated somewhere close to your family, close to your community, so that there is more support, all of this stuff. That's the ideals. Our prison industrial complex is not actually geared towards keeping people's humanity intact.
Right.
And so frequently people will be moved to maybe a higher security prison or just a different prison. And so then they're moving across state lines. It's not always easy to track, but also, like, who's to say it's not because of, this other prison needs more laborers to make their whatever.
Yeah. And there have been cases when judges have taken kickbacks in order to increase the labor pool available.
Yeah.
So,
And that's one of the things that, particularly for congregations and for faith communities, there are companies who make furniture and sell it. And it's good furniture. And it's not
sometimes.
ridiculously, sometimes, and it's not ridiculously expensive, but it's made from slave labor. It's made from the labor of prisoners who aren't treated fairly, have choices.
Yes. Also, two other groups in America that are not required to receive minimum wage, not that minimum wage is that great right now, but that's a whole separate deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
are disabled people, and also then there's the tipped labor group.
Mm-hmm.
Disabled people can be paid less than minimum wage by federal law and are often found to be exploited because they cannot protect themselves. Vulnerable adults are vulnerable for a reason.
Yep. And for disabled people, particularly, like, the idea behind it is they cannot produce or work at the same rate as able-bodied people, which is maybe accurate, maybe not accurate, but nobody produces at the same rate as each other.
Right.
And there are organizations that run, like, thrift shops where they specifically hire disabled people so that they don't have to pay a living wage
Right.
or minimum wage. So when it comes to thrift shops, I know thrift shops are great for myself for buying clothes. And we still have to be careful about where we're shopping.
Yeah. And then tipped workers are not required to be paid minimum wage.
They actually usually have their own minimum wage. It's just like two
They're
or
not
three
required to be
dollars an
paid the
hour.
usual minimum wage, which is usually like $2 or $3 an hour. And because tips are so hard to track and can be manipulated in so many ways, it's much harder to make sure that tipped workers' bosses don't manipulate their tips or straight up steal their tips
Mm-hmm.
in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I remember when I worked for a couple months as a host at a place, and so I got a percentage of sales that was paid to me from the tipped wages of other people. And the place that I was working at, if people tipped on to go orders, it went just to the company. And they
Mm-hmm.
presumably, like, used it for like a holiday party or something. I was not around long enough to confirm or deny that, but other people were like, yeah, that's not true. But also, it was not clear when I was hired, like, how it averaged out. And
Right.
so I thought that it would be like, oh, in any given day, or maybe even any given week, it would, like, that would be how it averaged out. And it was any pay period. So 2 weeks total. So I always ended up, like, the days that I did make enough or more than enough got discounted
Right.
because it filled in the days that I didn't make enough instead of being extra on those days.
Yeah.
One of the places that we kind of read about slave labor in terms of, like, pop culture and fantasy stuff is in the Hunger Games. That's the ways that the Hunger Games, the districts are set up. Especially District 11 is kind of the most traditional slave labor practices that we know about because it's very agrarian and limits particularly like what people are able to eat, and has like it is the closest to resembling chattel slavery of all of them, but like working in the mines and all of that stuff. There's been a lot of work that has been done by labor unions, and we'll get into into like the economics a lot more this summer with some of our deep dives, because we are in the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of Luke is all about economics and economic equity and equality. But Hunger Games does a pretty like accurate portrayal of like what slave labor can look like.
Yeah. Also, if you're looking for a more interactive illustration of what that can look like in a PG-13 way and a similar way, the video game Forgotten City that came out last year includes some debt labor and shows what that does to people over time.
Mm-hmm. And also, if you're looking at kind of a bouncing back and forth with chattel slavery in the US and contemporary times, Kindred by Octavia Butler is
Yes.
fantastic in terms of that like it does a really great job of having someone. So it's a Black woman who goes back in time to slavery times in the US, and like she keeps going back and forth between times, but it really gives a better understanding of chattel slavery in the US. I think like it gives it from a like contemporary perspective and in person being a victim of chattel slavery.
Yeah.
One of the other things that has come up particularly recently with the leaked Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade is adoption. A lot of people think about adoption as this great alternative to ending an unwanted pregnancy. And the reality is that adoption is very tied to colonization and colonialism, settler colonialism, and is part of human trafficking. So we saw this a lot, especially under Trump. I don't think it has fully stopped or fully been addressed, but under Trump, when immigrants crossed the border, families were separated, kids were separated, and parents were frequently deported. And it was ruled that kids should not go back because it was dangerous. And so then they ended up being put in foster and foster to adopt situations, many of which were headed up by Christian evangelicals and adopted out into new families.
And made these adoption companies a lot of money.
Yeah, that is human trafficking.
Yeah.
The parents and the families did not willingly put their kids up for adoption, did not give their kids to foster care. The majority of those kids had some sort of family connection in the US and were not sent to live with those families. It was also harder for those families to like get the kids because of documentation status and fear of retaliation by the government.
And for that matter, if you get deported, international law is super expensive and also very complicated.
Yep. Yeah. And this was tied with many of the people with uteruses who were in detention centers having forced hysterectomies. So there's forced sterilization on one hand and adopting those kids out into primarily white families who are not going to help them maintain their culture.
Right. Or connections with their family.
Yeah. So adoption as human trafficking is real. There's a great Twitter thread by Rebecca Nagel that talks about it. The most common kids to get adopted transracially are Native children. There's actually laws that have been passed about that. And then as we've gotten more and more conservative justices, those laws have been rolled back a lot, but there are laws in place to try to protect that, because that is part of cultural genocide, is to adopt children out, to take children out of their culture.
Yeah.
So Native children and Black children are vastly overrepresented in foster care and in adoption domestically. And part of the leaked document said that the domestic supply of infants for adoption was low.
Which is a dystopic phrase that, Stephen King could wish he could invent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For many of us, it is just baffling that anybody would think that that would justify anything.
Right.
Infants are, in fact, it's not a supply and demand thing. That's not how humans work. That's not how humanity...
People are people and not objects, even when they're, infants and can't speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so The Twitter thread with Rebecca Nickel gets into that a fair amount. But also that ties into The Handmaid's Tale, which is a really popular kind of view into or visit into that sort of what happens when
Right.
there's not enough babies being born in a dystopia. Disclaimer to say, Margaret Atwood is maybe trying not to be a TERF. She made turfy comments and then, unlike other authors who doubled down on them, she stopped and started to listen. But we don't know where she's at. So
Right.
just a disclaimer that that is the case. And the particular, I only know the shows because I watched some of the show, but it very much centers cisgender white women as a telling of the history that is actually primarily the historical reality of Black and brown women.
Yes. And she does note in, I don't remember if it was the foreword or a appendix afterwards in the original book, that all of the things that happen in the book are things that have happened in real life. The clothing restrictions and the various other things that are portrayed are things that have happened in real life to various people around the world. And she did that intentionally, but of course that note was not carried forward into the TV series.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also the note did not really go into depth about where any of those things particularly came from, because she's a novelist and not a historian.
Yeah. Most of those things have happened in the United States.
Yeah. As we continue to talk about human trafficking, of course, very often the type of human trafficking that tends to get the most attention in the media is sex trafficking. And we are not here for insulting sex workers who enter that life by choice. Sex work is real work.
Mm-hmm.
Although we can also acknowledge that this is a complex conversation, because there is no way that consent doesn't get murky when money enters the equation and you have to pay your electric bill. So
and
that can get complicated.
And that's an issue with all of these things that we've talked about, right? When it comes to tipped labor, when it comes to, there are so many people right now who, particularly Starbucks and Amazon, and they're working on unionizing and facing retaliation, which is illegal.
Right. Although, hey, if you need a beacon of hope in this time and place, following the labor movement has really buoyed me up over the last several months.
Yeah.
So
there's a Starbucks union Twitter handle that I'll try to find, that they tweet every time a store votes on unionizing. So
awesome.
Basically every day there's a tweet.
Yeah, I get most of my news through Jorts, which is probably not, academic of me, but
I think it is great.
I should specify, I get most of my news about the labor movement through the Jorts Twitter account. I get other kinds of news via other methods.
Yes, and we'll try and link to both the Starbucks one and Jorts for folks who are interested in following them on Twitter.
Yep.
So circling back, when it comes to sex trafficking, one of the reasons that it is used is this protect your daughters kind of mentality.
Yeah.
Part of why it is complicated is the laws in this country around sex work that make sex work illegal and that punish sex workers. They are supposed to punish those who are higher up, those who are controlling sex workers, that sort of thing. They very rarely actually prosecute or punish people seeking out sex workers. There are people who are victims of sex trafficking who have been prosecuted for sex work.
Yes.
It's hugely complex and problematic. And there are also people who choose to do sex work because it is real work and because it is work that they want to and can do with their bodies. And when particularly Christians say, oh, but you're selling your body, part of what we also have to name is we all sell our bodies. Right now, the number of people who are working with COVID are working when they should be resting and letting their bodies recuperate. They are selling their bodies, right? When you talk about factory workers who are disabled from the work that they do, that is a selling of your body. Your well-being, your health, and your abilities are sold for labor.
Yeah. And also, again, the media is not always terribly accurate in talking about how this actually works. And in the last few years, the QAnon movement has raised a lot of really inaccurate ideas about specifically how sex trafficking works. And so
Mm-hmm.
we would encourage you to please not listen to anything that comes anywhere near QAnon for so many different reasons, but also because they're particularly bad at this.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking for a resource to learn more, Lutheran Social Services of Minnesota put out a congregational study, sort of a Bible study or a related study, that's called My Neighbor Is Not for Sale,
Mm-hmm.
which is available freely, although they do ask a small fee if you want them to print it out and send it to you. And you can find that on their website, and we can link to that in the episode description.
Yeah. And what it ultimately comes down to is any sort of conversation, especially if it involves moralizing around sex trafficking, that doesn't include people who are sex workers, is not going to be helpful. It's not
Yeah.
going to be accurate, and it's most likely going to harm people.
Yeah, ultimately speaking, getting self righteous about sex work, all it actually does is hurt people. And that's in the long run, and that's not helpful. And so you may be asking yourself, well, why are we talking about this in the first place? Well, it turns out that in our first reading for today, Paul interacts with a girl who's been enslaved, and he takes away her power of divination, which, like, I'm not saying she had divination powers, the text does.
Mm-hmm. Spirit of divination, I think, is technically what the text says,
Yes,
with an
yeah, her
exorcism
ability,
involved.
basically.
Yeah.
And so he changes her life. Um, and then there's a lot of different ideas about what happens to her afterwards, but the short version is we have no idea because Paul stops paying attention to her as soon as she's no longer annoying him, which, like, misogyny, obviously. Also, it's not like the Bible can tell us the full life story of everybody who appears for 5 minutes, that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
But I have heard sermons and I have read way, way, way too many guiding resources for how to preach this text that say that, well, obviously her enslavers would have freed her immediately and she would have gone on to lead a wonderful and joyous life. And,
No.
like, we don't have any proof of that either. And if you're going to enslave someone, then probably you're not going to be a decent human being. And it's very possible that her enslavers would have, sold her or immediately moved her into a different and possibly worse kind of work. And we have no idea.
Yeah. And they, like, we do know that they have Paul and his companions flogged and arrested for this.
Yeah,
So, like, they are not upstanding human beings. They have enslaved someone, which is not good. And then they try to, like, harm the people who basically, like, make that person not
yeah.
worth the.
And when they get Paul arrested, it's not like they're getting him arrested for something that we actually have proof that he did. They got him arrested for something else because they were irritated
Mhm.
by this.
Which also, like, Paul did not see this girl and say, a person is enslaved. That is bad. Let me fix that. He
Right.
only did it because she was annoying him.
Yeah. And arguably, she was also helping him at the same time.
Right? I
So
was like, she's like
it's
telling people the truth about what y'all are doing. Why are you getting so annoyed?
Yeah, and she's like actually giving you credibility because the people around you believe in her gifts.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll presumably get there in a little while. So this is why we wanted to take this deep dive today.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we acknowledge that this is not a very cheerful topic, but we have provided resources that can offer you some constructive ways to look into it. And again, if you need a little bit of cheer and happiness in your day, the labor movement is making great strides as we speak. So,
Yes, go labor. And stay tuned for more episodes where we'll dive into labor and capitalism and homelessness and all sorts of things with amazing guests.
absolutely. So, our first reading for today is from Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 34. Paul gets irritated by a enslaved girl and exercises her prophetic ability out of frustration. Having destroyed their business, her owners have Paul and Silas flogged and thrown into prison. After an earthquake, Paul and Silas share the gospel with their jailer and his family, who are baptized. Really, there's a lot going on in this
Yeah,
text.
this
So,
is this is a long reading
yeah.
because it's a long story. So one of the themes in this passage is breaking out of jail. What a surprise. That happens actually like with a fair amount of frequency in fiction,
Yeah,
both in
yeah.
like written fiction
Turns
and
out there's some suspense to that, huh?
yeah, I know, weird. This is like a very different kind of breaking out of jail than, for example, in Battlestar Galactica when they try to break out of jail, because then it happens more via like conspiring and plotting and maybe even a bit of mutiny, depending on who it is, because it happens multiple times that people are broken
Right.
out of the jail, but not really ever and because of an earthquake. Not the least of which is because they're, on spaceships and not on Earth. So the possibilities of an earthquake are pretty slim to none. But
Right, but like this is a divinely inspired earthquake,
this,
presumably. So, like, I suppose if God wanted there to be an earthquake in a spaceship, although that would probably end even worse.
yeah, I was gonna say like there could be like an asteroid belt or something, but then like you're risking damaging the entire like fleet. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's a very like militarized thing. And one of the things we didn't talk about is the like we alluded to prison industrial complex. There's a whole other deep dives we could do into the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, how those are convoluted. Battlestar
Yeah.
Galactica definitely is like very military, and so the like police are military. And so as we dive into the verses, in verse 16 we read, "One day as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a girl who was enslaved, who had a spirit of divination, and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune telling." This reminded me a lot of the Graceling series, especially the first book, but it continues to varying extents in Bitter Blue as well, where the Gracelings, so the people with graces, with some sort of extra power, sometimes the power of divination, sometimes the power of baking bread delightfully, or other things, actually were enslaved to kings. So if a Graceling was born, they were considered the property of the kings who were ruling at that time and worked for them unless the kings were like, your grace is totally pointless, go back home. Because some people like the grace is like swimming or opening their mouth to the entire size of their head. Not helpful for the king grace. So that also ends up being clearly corrupt and not good. But that's not what humans are made for. So,
Yeah, like you don't actually have to, focus your entire life around pancakes even if you are good at them.
yeah.
And then in verse 18 we read, "She kept doing this for many days. But Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the Spirit, 'I order you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her.' And it came out that very hour." So in this verse, we see Paul gets annoyed at the girl who is, like, basically, arguably helping them because, again,
Right?
the neighbors believe in her abilities, and she is saying, hey, these guys are legit.
Yeah.
And she's, following them around and yelling a lot, which I can see getting irritated with, but ultimately speaking, this should have been helping Paul and Silas.
Yeah. That's what I was
But
thinking.
at this moment, I am torn between the various options of when I imagine Paul being angry, what kind of angry am I picturing? Is his style of anger more the Avatar The Last Airbender style, with the gigantic eyes and the steam coming out of his ears and the arms waving and lots of jumping up and down? Or is he more the Studio Ghibli style that involves, tearing out the hair and wailing with exasperation a lot? Or I want to be able to picture this clearly because I don't actually like Paul much at this moment, and so I feel the need to make fun of him a little bit.
That's fantastic. I vote. I don't know. What if it's a hybrid?
Yeah, there are other options.
A
There are
Studio
certainly options I'm
Ghibli
not familiar with,
Avatar.
so I think we need to keep this on the back burner and continue considering it.
Yes. Dear listeners, if you want to show us what you think Paul would look like, please do, and we will
Absolutely.
absolutely adore it. And then in verse 19, we read, "But when her owners saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities." So this is, right, an intro into policing and the reality that policing is about profit and exploitation. So similar to in the Expanse series, Mars is a very militaristic, it's not country, planet, like
Civilization,
nation statey thing. So there are all
society.
society. Yeah, there we go. So they are all military all the time. And then it ends up like there's corruption and people start to try like are working on acquiring and retaining all the money and the technology and all of this stuff, and it's a glimpse, if you're paying attention, into the ways that it's corruptible when it is there to protect finances and to protect capitalism, basically, rather than to protect people.
Yeah. And then in verse 24, we read, "Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet to the stocks." And I cannot possibly be the only person who reads this verse and immediately is reminded of the "what we need now is a feat of strength. No, now that I'm here, what we have is a great strength of feet" moment in Robin Hood Men in Tights, which of course is a reference to the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves movie with Kevin Costner. But my favorite moment of Men in Tights is still when Carrie Elwes reminded us that unlike most of the Robin Hoods, like, for example, Kevin Costner, because that movie was mostly about making fun of the Kevin Costner Robin Hood movie, he had a British accent. So,
I don't know if I've ever seen all of either of them.
the Prince of Thieves movie is not terrible, especially for a Kevin Costner movie. The Men in Tights one mostly still stands up. The humor sometimes gets a little esoteric now because we don't recognize the 90s references, but it's not bad.
I mean, I imagine I would probably recognize some of the 90s references, but I was a kid
Yeah.
then, so who knows?
Well, and it's making references that adults in the 90s would have gotten. So,
So I might not.
But mostly.
Yeah. Our second reading is from Revelation chapter 22, verses 12 through 14, 16 through 17, and 20 through 21. Because why be simple?
Well, this is actually one of the cases where I'm not necessarily against leaving out some of those verses because, like, if you left them in, your entire sermon would be explaining them. So.
Which one? Now I have to, like, check. I didn't look at them.
It's, well, verse 15 is definitely a list of people who are going to hell.
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember 18 through and 19, but...
Oh, 18 and 19 is if you add a word to this book, you will, like...
Oh, yes.
Be in...
Okay, actually, those I'm up for leaving in, because, like, let's get people to stop misquoting scripture, and while we're at it, the book is called Revelation and not Revelations, but moving on.
Anyway, in our Revelation reading, Jesus blesses those who will come to the holy city and welcomes all to the water of life. So in this passage, one of the themes is welcome or invitation, and it's a problematic example, but it is one of my favorite examples is Katniss in Mockingjay when the rebels, led by District 13, are battling in District 2, who is usually closely allied with the Capitol. And Katniss has this like invitation and call of like, we're not each other's enemies. We are all like under the thumb of the Capitol. And it's this like beautiful invitation to people to join her side, you know, and then she like gets shot and she's wearing bulletproof armor, but yeah, I was like, but then as I was saying this, I was like, no, you know what's a really great one though? The Wizard of Oz series. Because when people show up in the Emerald City in the books, there's a whole series of books. When people show up in the Emerald City, they really are welcomed.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to imagine the Holy City as the Emerald City.
Excellent. Although maybe we wouldn't all have to have green tinted glasses stapled to our heads, which I think is how it actually works in the books. But
I don't know that they have them stapled to their heads. I don't remember how exactly it works.
Like, you definitely can't take them off. Yeah.
I like came up with all these ideas, and then as we're recording, I'm like, no, I like this. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 13, we read God saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It's merisms. So merism is a Hebrew poetry technique that I love and that I will point out pretty much every time it comes up in the Bible because it is awesome and we don't talk about it enough and it is very queer. But a merism is naming the ends of something that might be a spectrum in order to encompass everything on that spectrum. So the alpha and the omega is the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, all the way through the whole Greek alphabet. The first and the last is the first, second, third, fourth, all the way through to the last. The beginning and the end is really the beginning, middle, and end. So it is everything between, and because we recognize that spectrums are limited, It is everything between and beyond. So next time you read
Yeah,
Genesis 1, don't forget the merism.
because they're not false binaries.
Exactly.
And then in verse 14 we read, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates." And from this verse we can conclude that being able to do one's own laundry is a matter of cosmic importance. Do your chores, kids. Well, maybe. Or possibly it's a metaphor about morality, or allowing God's grace to wash over you. Or maybe John just got a little lost in his metaphor. Which makes me think of Biff from the Back to the Future movies, and he tended to mix his metaphors quite a bit and sometimes just like connect them with completely unrelated things. And one of my favorites was in the third movie when Biff's ancestor said, "I'll hunt you down and shoot you like a duck." Which, like, okay, yes, some people do indeed hunt and shoot ducks, but that is not how that line is supposed to go.
How's it supposed to go?
Like a dog.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So,
I like this one better, but
yeah.
yeah.
When you said Biff, I was like, oh, you're gonna, okay. I was thinking of Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's childhood pal, and I was like, oh,
No, not that one.
all in
I still
like
haven't read that one.
mixed metaphors, but I totally could see Biff doing that. That is the
Okay,
kind of character
sure.
he is.
But yes, in the Back to the Future movies, the character Biff and his various relatives do that regularly. So, because that is totally a family trait that carries over the course of 100 years. And then in verse 16, we read, "It is I, Jesus, who sent my angel to you with this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star." And I am in the process of re-listening to the first campaign from Not Another D&D podcast at the moment, because I just got access to their extra episodes. And I had forgotten that one of the main characters, Hard One Sherfit, keeps collecting various titles and nicknames, and every one or two of which he actually gave himself. And he likes to introduce himself by a couple of them at a time to create a certain expectation of the people he's talking to, or just to sound more impressive. And some of them are good at that, and some of them less so, but they are pretty fun. However, in this case, Jesus is probably just trying to make sure that we actually know what's going on and who he is, which is fair. So,
Yeah. And then in verse 17, we read, "The Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let everyone who hears say, Come. And let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes take the water of life as a gift." So, this is your periodic reminder that Flint, Michigan still has no clean water, even though a certain Tesla company owner said that he would provide clean water for everyone in Flint, Michigan, and unsurprisingly, a billionaire lied about what he would do with money. And also,
shocking.
another reminder that the mayor of Chicago is trying to privatize and bottle their water, so that's the only way people can get clean water in Chicago, because Chicago has similar problems to Flint, Michigan, though not quite the same. And those are only two of many places where water is in fact not a gift, not a right, but something that is restricted and held back from many.
Although I'm now trying to imagine how they're going to pull off privatizing Chicago and bottling Chicago's water, around St. Patrick's Day when the river is green. But I don't think that one's going to go so well.
Yeah.
And it's not like the city's going to put up with them trying to take away the St. Patrick's Day turning the river green thing. So
yeah, but also like the turning the river green is like approved by marine biologists or whatever to like not be harmful.
Yes.
Which is
no, it's not harmful, but also like, would you buy a bottle of green water?
I think the number of people that would buy a bottle of green water on St. Patrick's Day is ridiculously high.
Okay, that's actually true. Huh. I did not mean to argue in favor of Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Okay, that. Moving on. Our gospel reading today is from John chapter 17, verses 20 through 26. Jesus prays that all people may be one in God through him, and continue to make God's name known in the world.
So, this is a lot of confusing rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's even hard to describe what Jesus is saying in this last great discourse of Jesus's before the crucifixion. But every time we get to one of those points where it's just so convoluted, it's hard to understand. I always just think of Doctor Who and the ways that Not always, because there are some episodes where it's like easy to track and you can figure out why things are happening in whichever ways. But many episodes where it's like a surprise ending, it's like, okay, how did it get there? And then the doctor like explains it, and it is this whole convoluted, confusing rhetoric of the doctors of like
Yeah.
this and then this and then this and then this and then this. And the logic is there, I'm sure, for Jesus and for the doctor. I'm just not sure where the logic actually.
Yeah. And as we jump into the verses, in verse 20 we read, I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word. So that second group of people is us, by the way. The later members of the church who did not actually meet Jesus in person. There have been a few of us by now. And even though Paul and many people in the New Testament thought that Jesus was coming back pretty much right away, Jesus seems to have assumed that there would be at least some time for the church to grow without him walking around. And one of the oldest questions that Christianity has is why he's not back yet. I'm personally still pondering an idea I mentioned in an episode some months ago, which is how do we know Jesus hasn't been back for some time and we just haven't noticed or recognized him? Maybe he's not going around introducing himself. Or maybe he is and everyone is hearing him pronounce it Jesus and not assuming that that's, the same Jesus.
Oh my gosh, that reminds me of the meme where it's like all of these like white people who are sitting around this like big fancy table for dinner. They're like, "Thank you, Jesus, for this food." And then it has a Latino man in a field like picking
Mm-hmm.
picking some sort of
The crops.
fruit. And he's like, "De nada."
Right. So maybe Jesus just has one of those faces and he looks like everyone else. We don't know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if we're the body of Christ, then we're made in God's image. Then really, Jesus has been back. Jesus never left. Jesus has been here the whole time in us. That's why we're called Christians, little Christ.
Yep.
I know. I just made a children's sermon out of it.
Awesome.
And then in verse 22, we read Jesus saying, "The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one as we are one." And again, as Kay likes to point out with the Trinity, bad math. Like, is this 1 plus 1 equals 1? Or is it like 1 plus 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 1, all in parentheses, plus 1 plus 1 in parentheses, equals 1? How many ones can you add together to make 1?
I guess that depends on whether we all are the body of Christ, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. I love math.
Indeed. And then in verse 25, we read, Righteous Father, the world does not know you, but I know you, and these know that you have sent me. And this sounds like an unusual take on the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. By the way, thanks to an old friend from college who pointed out years ago that all Christians are actually only 2 degrees from Kevin Bacon, because we know God, and God knows Kevin Bacon.
Okay.
And this verse proves it, right?
I mean, is Kevin Bacon Christian?
I think God would know Kevin Bacon even if Kevin Bacon wasn't.
Yeah, but does Kevin Bacon also know God?
Kevin Bacon doesn't have to. God knows Kevin Bacon.
I know, but like, I know Kevin Bacon. Like, can you know someone if it's not mutual?
That is a very different and possibly xenophobic look on things, but okay.
I mean, no, it's not. It's not xenophobic. I mean, like, when we're talking about the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever, right? Like, it's the 6 degrees of separation.
Yes.
But the assumption is that there is a relationship in each of those degrees.
I mean, not much of a relationship. Sometimes it's this actor very early in their career had one walk-on cameo in the movie.
Oh, I was thinking it was more of the like 6 degrees of separation, where there's like 6 degrees of separation between you and like basically anybody, and so it's like
yes,
you're in a relationship with this person, who's in a relationship with this person, who's in a relationship with this person. So I was thinking relational 6 degrees.
Yes, that is another game that people play, but the traditional 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game is a question of this person was in a movie with that person, was in a movie with that person, was in a movie with that person who was in a movie with Kevin Bacon. And like being in a movie with someone does not mean that you ever actually interacted.
That's fair. I did not realize that was the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon game.
Sure.
I not familiar with that game.
To be fair, it's less popular now, and I am a slightly older Xennial than you are.
It's true. You are a Xennial, and I am a Millennial, in fact.
Yes.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you for explaining that to me and to our dear listeners who hopefully maybe
Indeed.
we're also a little confused.
We love you, Gen Z. Assuming that you're out there.
They are. They are. They're around.
Well, I know they're around, but are they listening?
Yeah. And then in verse 26, we read Jesus continuing, I made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them. This is not necessarily the same as in the West Wing when campaigning and trying to get the name known of your particular presidential candidate. Although maybe it is. Maybe it is making your name known. Jesus is our like campaign manager.
That is an interesting take on it.
Or wait, no, this would be Jesus is God's campaign manager.
I would think the Holy Spirit would be God's campaign manager.
I would think so too, but Jesus
Like
is the
long
one
term.
praying.
Like maybe maybe Jesus is more of a consultant.
Or the press secretary,
I suppose.
setting the groundwork, and then the Holy Spirit comes in with the campaign manager as campaign
Sure.
manager.
Sure, that makes sense.
You know, it's been a while since we had a West Wing reference, and
Yes, that was wrong of us.
this week.
We should talk about the West Wing more often.
Yeah. And now for our newest segment, let's make a Muppets musical, where we
Yay.
cast something as a Muppets musical. I was kind of thinking about Miss Piggy as the girl who was enslaved, because she would be like, y'all, this is, like, she would just tell it like it is and do
Yes.
it in a really annoying way.
And then after Paul destroyed her life, she would karate chop him.
Yes. That was my thought.
And I was continuing to think about Paul getting angry and what would Paul's kind of anger be. And when it comes to getting angry, the Muppet I tend to think of first is Bert. Because he always gets so frustrated when he's talking with Ernie. And so Paul as Bert, I have to say I can definitely see it. Especially with the, like, Bert always gets to that hair pulling out stage, so I guess I am a little bit more the Studio Ghibli side of things for him. But
now I really want Ernie to be the enslaved girl, because that would be like, I mean, you could have
and
like
Ernie always irritates Bert with that cheerful grin on his face because nothing he's doing should be irritating because, usually he's helping, which is perfect.
Yep, yeah. And, having Rubber Ducky around to help out too. That'd be just...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Everything's better with a rubber ducky. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than your favorite set of custom rubber duckies.
Aww. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.